In a lavish wedding setting in Hudson Valley, New York, Silas Caruso, a powerful, untouchable mafia boss, lets a thick leather wallet slip from his hand on purpose, right where it feels like an invisible trap has been set. Madison Crane, his bride-to-be, watches as a homeless woman with tangled hair and a torn coat. Kayla Mercer bends down, scoops it up, and quietly pulls a few bills with shaking fingers. In a single breath, Madison's faith in good people cracks in real time, while Silas's cold certainty hardens. In his world, there are only hunters and prey. But hours later, just as the ceremony is about to begin, Kayla shows up at the gate and demands to see the groom. No begging, no theatrics, only that wallet clutched like a promise. And when she's finally brought inside, she doesn't return it the way anyone expects. She returns it with something heavier than money, a secret that can shatter the wedding, expose Madison and her mother, and drag Silas back to the past he's buried for 8 long years. If this opening sent a chill down your spine, take a moment to like the channel and show your support. Share this story with someone who can't resist a fierce, table-turning twist that changes everything in a single breath. And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next chapter waiting just around the corner. Grant didn't lead Kayla through the main hall. Instead, he took her around to a side entrance behind the garden, where rows of white tents blocked the guests' view. The jazz band's music still drifted from a distance, loud enough to drown out the sound of their shoes on the damp stone. He signaled for the 2 bodyguards to fall back, his voice low and final, telling them no one was allowed to film, and no one was allowed to follow. Kayla walked slowly, but she didn't lower her head. Her old, frayed coat fluttered lightly in the wind, and her hand clenched her wallet, as if it weren't an object at all. But the last proof of her dignity, she didn't look at Grant. She didn't ask whether Silas truly wanted to see her. She said only one short sentence, that she wouldn't repeat this a second time. The service room door shut behind them, sealing out the laughter and chatter outside as if the world had been muted. The room was small. It smelled of new wood, and the sweetness of wedding flowers still lingered in the air, a contrast so sharp it almost hurt against the way Kayla looked. Grant set a laptop on the table, his eyes never leaving her for even a second. When Silas stepped in, no one announced him. The door opened with almost no sound. He was still in his flawless wedding suit, tie perfectly set, his face cold as a winter lake. But in the instant his gaze met Kayla's, something caught, just a fraction of a beat, as if he'd heard his own name spoken inside an old dream. Kayla didn't move closer. She didn't step back. She placed his wallet on the table, then reached into her own frayed coat to pull out a tiny memory card she had kept hidden like a last line of defense. Her voice was rough, but it didn't shake, as she said he'd been deceived. Not an accusation, not a plea, just a truth, spoken the way an obvious thing is spoken. Silas didn't ask what he'd been deceived about. He looked at the memory card, then at her, as if weighing the past against the present. Grant understood the signal. He plugged the card into the laptop, not turning the screen toward them, letting only the sound play. The room fell into a silence so thick it felt like pressure before the recording came through. At first there was only rustling, the soft clink of glass against glass, and then a familiar woman's voice rose, smooth and carefully calculated. It was Patricia. There was no image, but every syllable was so clear it couldn't be mistaken. She said it would be enough if he believed she had betrayed him. A small laugh followed, not loud, but sharp as a blade sliding over skin. Silas didn't blink. His fingers tightened into a light fist on the table, yet his face showed nothing. Kayla waited. In her mind, she'd prepared for every possible outcome. She thought he would explode, that he would accuse her of making it up, that he would order her thrown out of this place before she could even catch her breath. She was used to not being believed, but Silas didn't do any of that. He turned to Grant and told him to lock the door. No one was to come in until he was finished speaking. His voice was deep and steady, the way it was when he signed a major contract. Grant nodded and stepped out to confirm it, leaving the 2 of them in the narrow room while the recording kept playing. Patricia added a few more scattered lines about keeping everything neat, about how to make someone disappear from the picture without leaving a single stain on her own hands. Kayla didn't look at Silas anymore. She stared at the floor, where their shadows stretched long beneath the yellow light. She hadn't come back for revenge. She'd come back because she couldn't let him walk into a marriage built on the same kind of lie as before. The recording ended with the sentence, "No one in that room could pretend they hadn't heard." The recording echoed her chilling strategy. to weave a web of lies so tight that Silas would have no choice but to doubt Kayla's loyalty. The air seemed to freeze in place, and in that moment, Silas Caruso understood that what Kayla had brought today wasn't a wallet being returned. It was the past he'd buried alive for 8 years, rising again in the middle of his wedding day. Outside the backstage area, the music kept playing as if nothing had happened, but the air had changed. Wedding planner Mara Klein moved between the tables with a smile stretched too tight, murmuring to the band to extend one more jazz number, signaling the service team to pour more champagne to fill the awkward gaps. The VIP guests in tuxedos and shimmering evening gowns began to lean closer to one another, their eyes sliding toward the door leading to the rear, where the groom had just vanished with a raggedly dressed woman. The whispers spread faster than wind skimming the surface of the Hudson. Madison Crane stood on the white runner like a perfect statue, her smile still held in place even as the muscles in her face began to ache. Patricia moved in close, her hand resting lightly on her daughter's back as a reminder to stay calm. She lowered her voice just enough for the people nearby to hear, saying how unfortunate it was that security had allowed an outsider to come in and disrupt such an important day, saying Silas was only handling a small misunderstanding and would be back any moment. Madison matched the rhythm immediately, nodding to a few close guests, saying everything was completely under control. But in her eyes, a flicker of worry passed as she glanced toward the door that remained firmly shut. She turned to Rafael Ortiz, the event's head of security, her voice lowered but sharp as a blade, as she demanded he remove that woman from the property at once. Rafael didn't avoid her gaze, but he answered shortly that he took direct orders from Grant Weaver, and he wouldn't do anything further until he received new instructions. The reply landed like an invisible slap. Madison had never been used to being refused, especially not on the day she believed all power sat in her hands. She looked around for confirmation from Patricia, but her mother only tightened her grip on her daughter's arm, her eyes going cold for a brief moment, before softening again the instant a guest stepped in to ask how she was doing. Patricia shifted to a different tactic, walking briskly toward the backstage entrance with the gentle smile of a worried mother. She told Rafael she only wanted to check whether Silas was all right, that today was far too important for a small misunderstanding to ruin everything. But the door stayed closed, and Grant appeared to block her with a firm shake of his head. No one was going in. Not now. Patricia's arm paused midair, her smile freezing for a fraction of a second, before she turned away, as if nothing had happened. At the center of the garden, Madison remained where she was, the glittering lights reflecting off her flawless hair, but inside, a quiet fear began to spread. What she feared most wasn't that homeless woman. What she feared was that Silas hadn't sent her a single message, hadn't offered a single reassuring signal, hadn't let her know what was happening. Throughout their relationship, she had always believed she could read him, could steer him with perfectly timed whispers. But now, that door was a wall between her and the power she thought she held. The murmurs began to turn into sharper questions, and Madison had to raise her voice, laugh louder, insist the groom was only handling a minor legal issue. Patricia returned to stand beside her daughter, whispering that she should hold her posture, that once Silas stepped out, everything would slide back into place. But even she wasn't sure she believed it. Time moved with a suffocating slowness. Then, at last, the door to the closed room behind the garden opened. The music seemed to miss a beat. Grant stepped out first, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. And behind him, Silas Caruso appeared, no longer the groom about to speak his vows, but the cold man who controlled an entire empire. His face held not a trace of hesitation. His eyes didn't search for Madison first. They swept across the whole garden as if he were assessing a chessboard. And in that moment, Madison understood she wasn't the one pulling the strings anymore. Silas walked along the white runner back toward the outdoor ceremony, as if everything were still exactly where it belonged. But only the people who looked closely could tell the atmosphere around him had shifted. He didn't hurry, and he didn't glance at Madison to reassure her. He stopped precisely where he was meant to, facing the priest and the floral altar, while wind moved through the rows of guests and made the ribbons tremble, tight as plucked strings. Mara Klein stepped in at once, whispering that they could continue, that the important guests needed a clean ending, that everything would be fine if both sides said the right few lines from the script. The priest tried to keep his voice warm, offered a small smile, and suggested they return to the ritual, as if what had just happened were nothing more than a technical glitch. Madison seized that opening on instinct, like someone used to living in front of cameras. She adjusted her skirt, lifted her chin, and turned toward Silas with eyes made to shimmer in exactly the right way. When the priest repeated the crucial question, Madison answered immediately, clear and loud enough for even the last row to hear. "I do." The two words fell like a stamp on a contract she believed had been signed long ago. A few guests exhaled in relief, a few scattered claps rose, and then died the moment they realized Silas still hadn't spoken. He didn't look at the priest. He didn't look at Madison. He didn't look at the crowd. He stared straight ahead, as if he were seeing through this lavish scene to something only he could understand. The silence stretched by one beat, then another. There were no more small laughs, no more clinking glasses. Even the band lost the rhythm. The garden was so wide, and yet so quiet. People could hear their own hearts thudding in their chests. Madison began to squeeze her bouquet so hard the thin petals bent under the pressure, but she kept smiling, the mask she wasn't allowed to let fall. Patricia stood below, her hand already half raised, as if ready to intervene if Silas said the wrong thing. The priest cleared his throat, about to repeat the question again, but Silas cut him off with a voice that was low, short, and cold, more an order than an answer. "No, I don't." The words weren't loud, but they dropped onto the ceremony like something heavy, shattering everything layer by layer. Madison went still, eyes wide as if she couldn't believe what she'd just heard. Patricia jerked upright, stepping up half a stair, her voice catching in shock before turning sharp as she demanded to know what he thought he was doing. The priest froze too, forcing a rescuing smile and saying perhaps the groom was under stress, that they could take a few minutes to breathe. But Silas didn't give anyone permission to soften the story. He turned slowly toward the crowd, his gaze sweeping in a circle as if freezing every whisper in place, and then he said, final and unmistakable, that the wedding ended here. No break, no private conversation to smooth it over, no script to save it. A wave of commotion rose. Phones lifted higher. Guests began to stand out of curiosity. A few murmured that this should be handled in a room, not in public. Madison clung to her last thread of hope. She tried to step forward and take Silas's hand, tried to whisper that they could talk in private, that he couldn't do this in front of all these people. But Silas pulled his hand back without violence, only with the same finality he used to close a door. He didn't explain, because explanation was permission. He only flicked a glance toward Grant Weaver by the technical area and signaled with a very small nod. The crowd assumed it meant the press would be escorted out, or that everything would be smothered into silence. But the large screen that had been waiting to play the bride and groom's love story slideshow went dark for a beat, then lit up with a different interface. A faint crackle came through the speakers, like a fracture opening in the middle of all this luxury. Madison whipped around, the blood draining from her face, because the first frame that appeared wasn't one of her wedding photos. It was an old video, yellowed light, and an angle that looked like security camera footage. And in that frame, the clearest figure was Madison herself. Younger, different in the face, with a smile that hadn't yet been painted to look innocent. The screen outside the ceremony trembled slightly, then shifted to old footage, and the moment Madison's face appeared in the washed-out security camera light, Silas's memory was yanked 8 years back, to an autumn in New York, when Kayla Mercer was still a young woman living on class schedules, work shifts, and a quiet kind of pride. Back then, Kayla was 20 years old, her hands always carrying the scent of coffee from the part-time job she worked at a cafe near campus, living in a small dorm room, taping reminder notes to the wall to keep herself steady, because her scholarship wasn't luck, it was responsibility. She didn't have time for luxury, and she didn't have the habit of asking anyone for anything. She paid for her books herself, mended her old coat herself, and kept her back straight when people looked at her as if she were only a name on a list of the ones who were being helped. Silas Caruso, at that time, wasn't yet a name that made a room fall silent, but he was already a man on his way up, moving through private meetings and short phone calls, through a world where power was measured in information and loyalty. He didn't show off how dangerous he was. It lived in the way he watched, the way he never said more than he needed, and the way he always knew who was lying before the person even finished the story. He met Kayla at a school fundraiser, where donors came to take photos and put their names on a corner of a wall. Kayla stood behind the drink station, serving as she always did, and when a guest dropped a sarcastic remark about kids living off scholarships, she didn't smile to please. She answered calmly that a scholarship wasn't pity. It was an investment, and she would make sure people never regretted placing their trust. Silas heard that, and in a rare moment when he wanted to know more about someone who had nothing to do with his interests, he walked over. They started with short conversations that stretched into evenings, when he drove her back to the dorm in an unmarked car, unflashy, and she always stopped at the gate because she didn't want anyone saying she was being kept by someone. Kayla had boundaries, and Silas respected them in the way of a man accustomed to respecting rules. No matter who set them, he still treated them as limits that had to be held. That was what softened Kayla. She didn't know how deep his world ran, only that beside him, she didn't feel like she had to prove her worth. And Silas, for the first time in years, felt there was a place where he didn't need armor. Then Madison Crane appeared like perfumed wind. She was an intern at a media company tied to the school events. Beautiful, friendly, skilled at making closeness feel effortless. Madison approached Kayla the easiest way, by handing her a cup of coffee, praising her for working hard, saying she admired independent women. Kayla was cautious at first, but Madison was polished enough not to make her feel pitied. Madison called Kayla her friend, introduced her to a few people, and Kayla began to feel, for the first time, that she was finally allowed to stand somewhere people looked at her as normal. Meanwhile, Patricia Crane, Madison's mother, didn't meet Kayla often, but she did meet Silas at private parties where people discussed reputation the way they discussed stock prices. Patricia saw it at once, that Silas's weakness wasn't money or power. It was his fear of betrayal, the fear of someone who had watched too many loyalties get sold for something small. She didn't need to break Silas with violence. She only needed to make him break himself. The trap was built with cold precision. One evening near finals, Kayla received a message from Madison saying there were important study group materials, and asking Kayla to bring them to the apartment of an acquaintance near campus. Kayla arrived in a rush, in a thin coat, her hair still damp from drizzle. The door opened. The room was darker than it should have been, and before Kayla could understand what was happening, there were hurried footsteps in the hallway, the click of a lock, fragmented voices arranged as if someone wanted them to be heard. Silas appeared in the doorway, his face pulled tight as wire. He saw Kayla in a scene that was just ambiguous enough, just wrong enough, for his mind to fill in the rest with his deepest fear. No crude details were needed, only an image placed in the wrong frame, and a sentence set in advance. Madison stood behind him, performing shock, one hand over her mouth as she let out a line that cut like a blade, saying she had tried to stop it but she hadn't been fast enough. Kayla stumbled through an explanation, but in Silas's eyes at that moment, the only thing left was collapse. He didn't shout. He said only one sentence, so cold it raised gooseflesh, that she was never to speak his name again, and then he turned away as if cutting off a part of his own body. Kayla ran after him into the hallway, her heart slamming out of rhythm, but the elevator doors closed in her face. And that same night, everything in Kayla's life was shoved off its axis. The dorm received an anonymous call of accusation. Her room was searched. Whispers spread like fire. She was told to leave temporarily for verification. And as she panicked and gathered her things, her phone disappeared. Her wallet disappeared too. Her student card, her documents, the little money she'd saved, all of it lifted from her bag in a moment she didn't even register. Kayla rushed outside looking for help, knocked on classmates' doors, begged to borrow a phone, but doors closed faster than her explanation could form. People looked at her with eyes full of curiosity and fear of being dragged in. Kayla stood in front of the dorm with one small bag, cold wind lashing her face, the streetlights thin and yellow, and for the first time in her life, she understood what it felt like to be turned into a story no one needed the truth for. She looked up at the sky, her breath turning into a pale thread that vanished in the air, her hands shaking not from the cold, but from humiliation. Then she tightened her grip on the bag strap, bit her lip until it hurt, and in silence, she swore she would survive. She would not disappear. She would not let anyone decide who she was. That image was like a cut that dragged Silas back to the present, where the screen still glowed in the wedding garden, and he stood motionless, his eyes reddening for 1 second, but not a single tear falling. The video kept playing, and the wedding garden, beautiful as a painting, suddenly became a courtroom with no warning, where every stare was a gavel coming down on someone's honor. On the screen, a younger Madison stood in a hallway lit with pale yellow light, her shoulders lifting with a laugh she would never dare reveal in today's ceremony. It wasn't a loud laugh, but it was enough for anyone to see. It wasn't innocent. It was the laugh of someone who was certain she'd already won. Then the audio layered in, and Patricia's voice slid through the space like a cold thread. She talked about turning Kayla into a story no one would believe, about how if you planted enough doubt, the truth would suffocate on its own, about how a poor girl without a powerful family would be crushed by whispers before she ever got the chance to open her mouth. The words didn't need to be violent, but every one of them carried the cruelty of someone practiced at manipulating public opinion. The crowd began to murmur out loud now. It wasn't whispering anymore. Someone raised a hand to cover their mouth. Someone took a step back as if afraid of being splashed by mud. Madison stood beneath the screen, her face drained white, but her instincts still clung to the last strand. She let out a dry laugh, turned to the guests, and said that these days anyone could be set up, that videos could be fabricated, that this was a filthy deepfake scheme meant for blackmail. She pointed sharply toward the backstage area, as if Kayla were standing there with her hand out for money, and her voice shook with anger tangled up in fear. Patricia backed her immediately, raising her voice with the offended dignity of an upper-class woman being insulted. She said they would sue, that the Crane family's honor couldn't be trampled by a stranger, that this was nothing but a cheap stunt aimed at Silas. The guests, who were used to scandals wrapped in pretty packaging, looked at one another, because this wasn't gossip anymore. This was something unfolding on a screen right in front of them. Silas didn't argue with Madison. He didn't spar with Patricia. He stood still, his face like stone, his eyes dark as a moonless night. His silence wasn't confusion. It was contempt, the kind that didn't consider their defense worthy of debate. He tilted his head only slightly toward Grant, and Grant stepped forward like a man who'd had everything ready before the wedding even began. Grant didn't raise his voice. He didn't perform. He opened a thin file, set it on the technical table, and said clearly that this video had an accompanying data chain, that the recording time, the recording device, and the storage location could all be verified. He pointed to a secondary screen displaying technical information, explained briefly that this was original data, bearing a timestamp and an authentication code from the camera system, something that couldn't simply appear out of a face-swapping program. He read out the name of a real witness, a person who had once overseen the building's security infrastructure, who had signed off that the footage had been extracted through the proper procedure. The crowd shifted from noise to shock, because this wasn't emotional storytelling. It was the language of the law. Madison opened her mouth to cut in, but her breath failed her. Patricia tried to smile thinly, but the corner of her mouth twitched, and right then, a car pulled up near the gate, and a man in a dark jacket walked in with a colleague, his stride calm but unmistakably authoritative. Grant leaned aside to make room. Officer Jordan Price appeared, showed his identification, and said, plainly, that his office had received information related to organized false reporting, evidence manipulation, and defamation. He didn't arrest anyone on the spot. He didn't turn the wedding into a violent scene. But what he said was enough for everyone to understand. The story had moved into a different level. Patricia's expression changed at once. She stepped forward with a social smile, her voice soft as velvet, saying there must be a misunderstanding, that she was willing to cooperate, that matters like this were often exaggerated. She turned to Silas, speaking in the tone of someone accustomed to standing beside power and believing she could bargain with it. She told him he should think about reputation, think about relationships, think about arrangements that didn't have to be dragged into the light. It was a threat wrapped in politeness, a reminder that everyone had something to lose. Silas looked straight at her, and this time he spoke, not loudly, but clearly enough for every person to hear each syllable. You just ended yourself. 4 words, but they landed like a period at the end of an entire life of scheming. Patricia froze, anger flashing in her eyes, but she still tried to keep the shell intact. Madison couldn't hold it anymore. She whipped toward her mother, her voice cracking as she screamed that it was all her mother's plan, that her mother had told her to do it, that she had only followed along to have a better life. The whole garden seemed to explode. Patricia turned on her daughter, eyes wide with shock and fury, the polish of her upper-class restraint dropping away in a single beat. She snarled, demanding if Madison understood what she'd just done. And in that moment, in front of hundreds of guests, in front of cameras catching every expression, Patricia Crane lost control completely, revealing the true face of someone who had always believed everyone else was just a piece on the board. In the moment, the Crane mother and daughter began tearing into each other in the middle of the ceremony. The whole garden turned into a hot pan, where every gaze needed a face to pour itself into, and that face was Kayla's. Phones lifted higher, whispers turned into blunt commentary. Some people looked at her with pity, some with curiosity, and some the way they looked at an event they'd retell at the next party. Kayla stood at the edge of the backstage area, close enough to catch Patricia's last words, far enough not to be dragged into the center. She could feel it. That familiar sensation of being placed on a table, examined under a bright light, turned into someone else's story. She'd spent years living in invisibility, and cruelly, when the truth finally flared on, it shone straight at her like a cold headlight. She hadn't come here for applause. She hadn't come to watch Madison be humiliated. She'd come because she couldn't stand a lie being stamped one more time. Now the lie had been ripped open, but the price was that she had become the target of attention, the thing she hated more than hunger. Kayla stepped back, then another step, slipping into the narrow passage between equipment cases and the row of decorative backdrops. She moved softly, like someone afraid of breaking something fragile, not an object, but her own right to retreat. No one stopped her, because everyone was watching Madison cry, Patricia snarl, Officer Price speak with Grant, and Silas remain like a wall in the middle of the garden. Kayla slipped through a side door, and cold air rushed at her collar at once, carrying the smell of wet grass and the lake. She didn't run, but her steps began to quicken, as if she slowed for even a second, someone would call her name and drag her back onto the stage. In her mind, an old sentence echoed, one that had followed her through years of wandering: don't stand under other people's eyes for too long, because they'll start rewriting you the way they want. Kayla left the wedding area, following the stone path toward the staff parking lot, where the light was sparse and there were no decorative cameras. She didn't know where she would go next. She only knew she had to get out before her truth was turned into entertainment. Meanwhile, at the center of the garden, Silas heard the noise as if it were being pushed farther and farther away, because in his head there was only one question left: where Kayla was. He turned back toward the backstage area, searching with his eyes between the white backdrops and the narrow walkways. Grant turned with him, reflexive, like a man who had been trained to protect his boss from every threat. But Kayla was no longer there. Silas moved faster, and for the first time that day, he showed a urgency that didn't belong to power. He called her name, not loudly, but loud enough for Grant to hear. No one answered. Grant bent over the table where Kayla had placed the memory card and saw a small piece of paper, folded neatly, like something she had meant to leave behind so she wouldn't have to face him directly. He opened it and read, then handed it to Silas. Just one short sentence, the handwriting slightly shaky but steady in its intent. Don't save me out of guilt. Silas stared at those words, and something inside him felt like it had been punched straight through. He was used to giving orders, used to control, used to bending entire systems to his will. But what he felt now wasn't strategic anger, and it wasn't calculation about how to contain a scandal. It was panic, deeply human, deeply personal. The kind you feel when you blink and realize the one thing you want to hold on to is slipping out of your hands. He lifted his head, his eyes darkening, his voice dropping into steel. Find her. Don't scare her. Silas didn't look for Kayla loudly. There was no showy motorcade, no people running around asking questions in front of the world. He only left the Hudson Valley when the sky had turned gray, sitting in the back seat of an ordinary, unmarked car, his coat pulled high, his eyes fixed through the window as if he were chasing something he couldn't afford to lose again. Grant sat in front, saying little, only taking the occasional call and answering in short phrases. Kayla didn't have a home to return to, no family to search for, but she had a survivor's habits, and those habits led her to places with warm light and a simple meal. By nightfall, they stopped at a food distribution point near the city, where a small church opened its doors for unhoused people to shelter during the cold season. Pale yellow light spilled from the windows onto the sidewalk. The smell of hot soup and bread drifted into the air. Silas stood outside for a moment, watching as if he needed to make sure he wasn't bringing the shadow of power into a place where people only wanted to be left in peace. He saw Kayla at the end of the line, holding a plastic tray, her hair still messy, her coat still old, but her back straighter than it had been when she disappeared. She didn't talk much. She only nodded her thanks to the person serving food, then sat in a quieter corner. For a moment, Silas wanted to walk straight to her, take her by the shoulder the way a man does with something he believes belongs to him. But he stopped. He remembered the note she'd left. Don't save me out of guilt. He went in, not letting bodyguards crowd close, only Grant staying a few steps away so there was no pressure. Kayla looked up when she felt someone standing in front of her. Her eyes didn't widen in surprise. They cooled slightly, like someone who had already guessed he would find her. She set her spoon down, looked him up and down, then glanced toward the door, as if checking whether anyone was watching them. Silas didn't sit right away. He stood there and said, in a low voice, that he only wanted to talk. Kayla let out a small, humorless laugh and asked why he was here, to hand over money to compensate for the years she'd lost, or to buy her silence before the press caught the scent of scandal. Grant shifted, but Silas signaled him to stay quiet. He didn't pull out a wallet. He didn't pull out a check. He didn't drop cash on the table as a way to end the story. He looked around the room, saw people eating in silence, saw exhausted eyes, and said this wasn't the place for a spectacle. He asked Kayla to step outside and talk for a few minutes. Kayla hesitated, then stood and followed him into the hallway, where cold air slipped through the cracks of the door. There was no music, no wedding flowers, only the low hum of an old heater. Silas began with one blunt sentence, that he had been wrong. Kayla didn't accept that apology. She asked where he'd been wrong, in believing other people, or in abandoning her. Silas went quiet for a beat, then said he'd been wrong because he had chosen what was easier than the truth. She looked at him, eyes dark as frozen water, and said the truth hadn't saved her from winter, hadn't saved her from nights when she slept afraid of being robbed, hadn't saved her from the feeling of disappearing from the world. Silas didn't argue. He only gave Grant a look, and Grant took out a thin envelope and placed it in Kayla's hand as if it were something that wasn't allowed to fall. Inside were temporary papers, so she could have her identity back, a medical appointment card, the number of an independent attorney, and the address of a small apartment leased under the name of an intermediary company, not tied to media or any photo shoot. Silas spoke slowly, saying she would have a place with a lock, with privacy, and most of all, with the right to refuse him at any time. No one had the right to enter that apartment unless she allowed it. Kayla looked at the papers, then at him, and the suspicion in her rose like a survival reflex. She asked what he planned to turn her into, a redemption symbol for a mafia boss, or a prop to restore his image. Silas said he didn't need public relations, and if anyone dared use her name for that, they'd be removed from the game. Kayla cut in at once, laying out her boundaries like building a wall. No interviews, no standing in front of cameras, no appearing like his trophy, and no other wedding meant to patch up someone's honor. She didn't want to be displayed again in any form. Silas nodded, without bargaining. He said one sentence that sounded like his rawest truth, that he wasn't good at asking for forgiveness. He was good at making things right. Kayla studied him for a long time, as if searching for something in those cold eyes beyond guilt and obsession. Then she asked, her voice quieter but sharper, the kind of question that made the air stop moving. Do you love me? Or do you just want the obsession to end? Kayla's question hung in the cold hallway like a taut wire, and Silas hadn't even had time to answer when Grant's phone began vibrating nonstop, like a storm alarm. Grant glanced at the screen, his expression shifting, then handed the phone to Silas. The news was already moving faster than any explanation. In just a few hours, entertainment pages and tabloid blogs had flooded their feeds with sensational headlines about a homeless woman crashing the wedding of the century, about a mafia boss being blackmailed right at the altar, about a model bride humiliated by a cheap con. The story had been twisted into something easy to swallow, where Kayla was no longer the person carrying the truth, but a predator who knew exactly how to strike at a powerful man's weakness. Edited clips appeared as if someone had been waiting with them ready. Dramatic music layered in, cuts timed to the precise moments Madison cried and Patricia raged so they could be framed as victims, while Kayla showed up only in a few blurred, zoomed-in frames with scrolling captions claiming she had pulled money from a wallet and come back demanding more. Patricia Crane didn't need to step out in public herself. She only had to make a few phone calls to the right people, send a few documents to the right places, and let the media machine do the rest. A lawyer spoke for her, saying the Crane family would sue for defamation, saying there were signs of extortion and image manipulation, saying what had been shown at the wedding could have been staged. An unnamed expert was brought onto a podcast to talk about deepfakes, as if that were the conclusion already stamped and sealed. Madison also appeared in a quick interview, eyes red, voice trembling like someone betrayed, saying she had only wanted one peaceful day, but had been dragged into something dirty. Everything moved with a smoothness that was terrifying, like a campaign written long ago, waiting only for the right moment to be activated. Kayla stood in the small apartment Silas had arranged, staring at her phone screen lighting up with headline after headline, and she felt a familiar chill crawl up her spine, the same cold from 8 years ago when her truth had been buried under rumor. Silas paced the narrow living room, his voice low but sharp, saying he could shut this down immediately, that he could make those sites go silent overnight. It was his instinct, the instinct of a man used to pressing a button and watching entire systems turn. But Kayla turned to him, her eyes tired but hard, and she said one sentence that sounded like a final boundary. "Don't turn me into an excuse." She didn't want anyone threatened because of her. She didn't want her story to become the reason power was unleashed on other people. She had endured enough of being used as a tool, whether a tool to destroy or a tool to save. Silas stopped. He looked at her as if he were learning something harder than any negotiation. Then he nodded. Grant shifted direction at once, like a man who knew how to build a defensive line with law instead of fists. He didn't chase scandal. He chased truth that could be verified. He contacted the church where Kayla had received food, requested statements from volunteers about how long Kayla had been there, requested confirmation that she wasn't someone who had appeared out of nowhere to make money, but a person who had been fighting to survive. He gathered a public timeline from nearby area cameras, from the wedding venue's entry logs, from Silas's own movements, to show Kayla had never had the chance to stage anything the way they claimed. He called the independent attorney Silas had introduced to Kayla and asked him to prepare a legal response, not an emotional post. Silas did something rare as well. He ordered his people to stop all impulsive moves. No one was to contact the media directly. No one was to apply pressure. They were only to provide data through legal channels. It irritated a few people inside his system, but he didn't care. Kayla sat on the edge of the couch, her hands wrapped around a cup of hot tea that still couldn't warm her, watching Grant work as if he were building a bridge for her to cross. And she realized, for the first time, someone was standing on her side without demanding she pay with silence. But Patricia's campaign didn't stop at articles. It wanted Kayla to retreat on her own. Kayla's phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number with no name. Just one short line, no emoji, no trace. "Leave him, or the past will come back." Kayla stared at the words, her heart squeezing tight, because the sender knew exactly how to hit the place where she hid her deepest fear. And in that moment, she understood this fight hadn't ended at the altar at all. It had only just begun. The threatening message from an unknown number didn't leave Kayla's mind just because the screen went dark. It followed her into mornings when she woke up in the small apartment with a secure lock, into the first steps she took outside when she still caught herself scanning for an exit, into nights when she heard cars pass on the street, and her heart flinched on its own, terrified the past would come rushing back. But Kayla had promised herself she wouldn't live on fear again, even if that fear came dressed up as protection, or what's right. She started with the smallest things, the things no one could do for her. She went to see a therapist the attorney recommended, not to recite tragedy like a story built for clicks, but to learn how to breathe when memory suddenly tightened around her throat. In a quiet room that smelled of chamomile tea, she spoke about winters spent sleeping at bus stations, about being called every name except her real one, about how every time someone asked who she was, she wanted to answer with silence because she was afraid the truth would be laughed at. The therapist didn't promise healing in a day. She only taught Kayla how to separate herself from shame, like lifting a dirty coat off skin. Kayla also went looking for work on her own. She didn't ask Silas to make a call. She didn't want anyone to hire her as a favor. She chose a modest job at a used bookstore, where the owner only needed someone who could organize shelves, dust, and smile at customers. On interview day, Kayla wore a simple blouse she'd bought at a thrift shop, her hair tied back neatly, a small note in her hand with answers she'd practiced in the mirror. When the owner asked her name, Kayla felt her throat go dry. For 8 years, she had grown used to being called by drifting labels. That girl, the homeless woman, the wedding crasher, as if she didn't have the right to own a whole name. She took a deep breath, planted both feet on the floor, and said each word clearly, without lowering her head, without apologizing. "My name is Kayla Mercer." The sentence seemed small, but it was like a key turning open a door inside her. The owner only nodded, wrote it down, and asked if she could start next week. Kayla walked out of the bookstore with her hands trembling slightly, not from cold, but because for the first time, she felt she had taken back something that belonged to her. She also enrolled in classes again. Not at a big school, only an evening course at a community center to rebuild her knowledge and recover her academic rhythm. She filled out the forms herself, read every line herself, chose dates and times that worked, as if she were rebuilding her life brick by small brick. Through all of it, Silas never stood right beside her. He didn't appear as a hero in her line of sight. Sometimes Kayla only noticed an ordinary car parked far down the street when she got off work. Saw Grant send a short message that the attorney had filed an official response. Saw a package of essentials left at her door with no note. Silas kept the promise he'd made, protecting her from a distance, not forcing himself into her space, not turning her into a condition for his emotions. Once, Kayla caught sight of him across the street under the glow of a traffic light, not stepping closer, only watching her like a man learning how to wait. Kayla didn't wave. She didn't turn her face away either. She just kept walking, but her steps were lighter, because she knew she wasn't alone against the media storm anymore. One night, while sorting through the few old belongings she'd carried through years of wandering, Kayla found something she'd hidden at the bottom of her bag like proof she had once been a person. It wasn't jewelry. It wasn't money. It was a library card with worn corners, the name Kayla Mercer printed on it, and on the back a small scratch, shaped like the letter S, a mark from the day Silas had picked it up, and joked that she held a library card the way other people held a ticket out of the dark. The card had no material value, but it was evidence that, once, she had belonged to a normal world where she was allowed to dream. Kayla held it in her hand for a long time, feeling as if she were touching the version of herself she used to be. Right then, her phone buzzed. An unknown number. A short, cold message with the same rhythm as before. Leave him, or the past will come back. But this time there was another line that made Kayla's blood seem to freeze. Don't forget the rainy night at the apartment on Harlow Street, where you knocked 3 times and no one opened. No one but the person who had built the trap would know that address. Kayla stared at the screen, her breath catching, and she understood the person behind this didn't only want to scare her. They wanted to remind her they had been watching for a long time, long enough to know details she thought only she carried. The message that mentioned the rainy night at the apartment on Harlow Street kept Kayla from sleeping, and by morning, she decided she wasn't going to hide anymore. She didn't call Grant first. She didn't text the attorney, because a question that had dragged on for too long needed to be answered with bare truth, without intermediaries, and without the cover of strategy. Kayla sent Silas a short message saying she wanted to see him, not at a luxury restaurant, not inside a high-glass office, but at a small cafe near the bookstore where she worked, a place where people said each other's names in ordinary voices, and no one knelt to power. Silas arrived on time, no bodyguards hovering beside him, a dark coat, his face still cold out of habit, but his eyes carrying a strange fatigue, like a man who had spent too many nights staring at the broken pieces he'd helped create. Kayla sat across from him, both hands around a cup of tea, and said plainly that she had received threatening messages, that they knew past details no one should know, and that she didn't want to be pulled back into a spiral where other people decided what she was supposed to fear. Silas listened without interrupting. Only when she stopped did he speak, not to promise protection like an order, but to confess something he had never said to anyone in the voice of a normal man. He said he had chosen Madison for stability, not because she was special, but because she was safe, in the way his world defined safety. A marriage that could be managed, written into contracts, used to soothe relationships and cover cracks. He said that in his world, softness was something people exploited, and truly loving someone was handing them a knife. He had believed that if he chose a woman who knew how to play a role, he would never have to place his heart on the table again. He paused, his gaze drifting to the window where people passed by in sunlight, and then he said the truest thing, that he had been afraid, not afraid of losing reputation, but afraid that the feeling of being betrayed again would turn him into someone even more ruthless than the man he was already trying to hide. Kayla listened without crying, without raising her voice. She looked straight at him like she was looking at a man no longer hiding behind a title. She said she didn't blame him with tears, because tears wouldn't return the years she had lost. But she also wouldn't accept being pulled into a love story as a way for him to redeem himself. She laid down her rules slowly, clearly, like placing boundary stones one by one. She needed agency. She needed the right to say no without being called ungrateful. She needed to walk at her own pace, not at the pace of a mafia boss trying to fix what he'd broken. She said she wouldn't rush into marriage, wouldn't stand in front of any cameras to make the story prettier, and wouldn't let anyone use her as a symbol of redemption or victory. Silas didn't react with the anger of a man used to giving orders. He nodded, then placed both hands on the table like a man locking himself into a commitment. He said, "You choose the pace, I'll follow." It wasn't a poetic promise. It was the largest surrender a man who lived by control could make. Kayla studied him for a long time, as if testing whether the sentence was only something said to get through the moment. Finally, she said only that she would try, but trying didn't mean belonging. Silas said he understood, and if he didn't, he would learn. They sat in silence for a few seconds, listening to the espresso machine hiss, listening to a child laugh at the next table. Ordinary sounds Kayla had forgotten what it felt like to live inside. When Kayla stood to leave, Silas didn't touch her hand. He only stood at the same time, keeping distance as if respecting an invisible line. And the instant she stepped outside, Silas's phone vibrated. Grant was calling, his voice low but urgent. He said someone was offering to sell Caruso internal information to the Crane side, something that wasn't only about reputation, but could drag their entire system into a major investigation. Silas watched Kayla's figure recede down the sidewalk, then his eyes darkened. This time, the enemy wasn't only hitting Kayla with threats. They were aiming straight at the deepest part of his world, where a single leak could be enough to set off a storm. Grant's call wasn't just a warning about a leak. It was a signal that everything had to shift from reaction to control, and in the cleanest way possible. That night, while Kayla had returned to her apartment and forced herself to sleep after the cafe conversation, Grant sat in a small back office behind the attorney's firm, cold fluorescent light washing over scattered papers and the glow of his laptop screen. He didn't replay the video that had detonated the wedding. What he needed now wasn't emotion. It was the path of truth. Chain of custody. Who recorded it? Where it was stored? How many hands it passed through? Who touched it? And why it still existed after 8 years in a world where money could make almost anything disappear. Grant began with the smallest details, device codes and timestamps, lines of technical data that looked lifeless to outsiders but were the only things incapable of lying. He called the technician who had signed off on the building's camera system years ago, cross-checked the equipment serial numbers, requested archived access logs, then pieced everything together like assembling a picture that wasn't allowed a single wrong stroke. Every movement of the file needed a witness, a verification mark, a reason for existing. Otherwise, the Crane side would twist it into something else. Near dawn, a name surfaced on the screen like a needle-piercing fog. Aidan Locke, a former contractor for a security maintenance company who had once been hired briefly to inspect the system in the building where the trap had been staged. Aidan had left that line of work long ago, changed addresses, changed phone numbers, like a man trying to erase footprints. Grant didn't call him directly. He had the attorney send a formal request for a meeting, with guarantees of identity protection. By the next afternoon, Aidan appeared in a small conference room, a baseball cap pulled low, eyes flicking toward the door as if expecting someone to walk in. He didn't look like a man eager to be a hero. He looked like someone who had carried a secret like a stone in his chest for years. Grant placed a thin folder in front of him and said this wasn't a conversation to beg for kindness. It was a conversation to do things properly. Aidan looked up, lips pressed tight, and asked quietly whether Silas Caruso truly wanted the truth, or just an excuse for revenge. Grant answered that if revenge were the goal, they would have chosen a different road from the beginning, and that Kayla herself had forbidden them from turning her into an excuse. That made Aidan fall silent longer. Finally, he exhaled and said that 8 years ago, when he'd been called to check a camera issue, he had stumbled upon an irregular extraction. Someone had requested a specific segment of footage, while the rest was to be deleted. He had made a backup copy, not out of bravery, but out of a technician's instinct that whatever someone wanted erased was usually what mattered most. But that same evening he received a call from a woman claiming to represent the Crane family. Her tone had been polite, but threaded with threat. She asked what he had seen, and reminded him that careers could vanish quickly if someone misunderstood things. Aidan panicked, cut off contact, stored the copy in a private drive, and left the industry. He said he had finally sent the file to Kayla anonymously a week ago, unable to bear the guilt any longer after seeing her struggling on the streets. He had only kept it as insurance for himself. Grant asked why he was willing to step forward now. Aidan looked down at the table and said when the video exploded at the wedding, He realized he couldn't hide forever. If the Crane side were cornered, they'd come looking for anyone who had touched that file and make that person disappear from the picture. Grant opened another document. Not video, but a transaction record obtained through proper channels. He placed a finger on an old transfer from an intermediary account tied to the Crane ecosystem, routed through a shell company, then paid to a broker. Grant stated plainly that they had traced the money used to stage the setup, something they hadn't revealed at the wedding because they hadn't wanted to turn everything into a dirty war. Aiden stared at the numbers, his face draining of color, then nodded slowly, like a man who had just seen the devil's name written in ink. Silas wasn't in that room, but his decision moved through Grant and the attorney. No coercion, no threats. Protect the witness with legal agreements, safety assurances, and coordination with Officer Price, so everything would stand firm in court if necessary. That was the modern form of power wielded by a mafia boss who understood that what destroyed people fastest wasn't a gun, but paperwork done correctly and evidence that couldn't be bent. As Aiden rose to leave, he paused at the door, turned back, and said in a voice rough with the weight of a decision finally made, "It wasn't just one incident. This is Patricia's pattern." Aiden Locke wasn't the kind of witness who stepped forward because conscience suddenly flared to life. He stepped forward because he was afraid, and because for the first time he believed that if he didn't speak, he would be swallowed along with the secret. Grant understood that immediately, from the way Aiden's eyes kept darting to the door, from the way he held his distance like a man afraid of being touched. That was why the next meeting didn't happen at a police station or inside Caruso offices, but in a neutral law office, where every word was recorded into minutes, where power couldn't pound a table and had to pass through signatures instead. Aiden sat across from them, fingers laced tight, his voice rough as he stated his terms, before offering a single additional detail. He wanted anonymity. He wanted a witness protection agreement. He wanted to be sure he wouldn't be turned into a sacrificial object in a war between wealthy people. He also wanted something that sounded more selfish, that his professional record wouldn't be completely destroyed, that when this was over he could still apply for work without being stamped as a traitor. Grant didn't show contempt. He only nodded and said it was reasonable, but everything had to follow procedure. There would be no verbal promises. When Kayla heard Grant's report, she went quiet for a long time. She had prepared herself for a world that wasn't fair, but part of her still wanted to believe the truth was valuable enough on its own for people to protect. She looked down at her hands and remembered nights standing outside a convenience store just to ask for a cup of water. Remembered all the times she had to explain she wasn't a bad person, only someone who had run out of road, and she let out a sentence that sounded both bitter and exhausted. Even the truth has a price. Silas didn't answer with comfort. He only looked at her, then said that price wouldn't be hers to pay, because she had already paid enough with 8 years of losing her name. He turned to Grant and ordered every agreement to be clean, tight, strong enough that the other side couldn't reach the witness through lawyer games. Grant agreed, but he also knew something more dangerous was forming. When a witness has conditions, someone else will try to buy those conditions. And Madison Crane, even while being swarmed by scandal, still had the one thing she was best at: buying time with money and fear. Madison didn't show up in public. She didn't call Aiden directly. She used an intermediary, a woman at a media agency that had once worked with the Crane family, to send an invitation that looked like a career opportunity. Aiden received the email, saw the fee being offered if he signed a clarification statement saying he wasn't certain about the file's origin, just one ambiguous line, enough to weaken the entire chain of custody. Aiden read it again and again, cold sweat breaking out. He wasn't rich. He didn't have a system behind him. And the truth was, fear didn't pay the bills. He called Grant, didn't say it outright, only asked whether, if he ended up in court, anyone would actually protect him, or only protect the story. Grant replied that they would protect him with law, with agreements, with verifiable truth. But Grant also couldn't lie and say there was no risk. When Aiden hung up, he sat alone for a long time in his rented room, staring at his phone like it was a door opening onto 2 roads. One was money and silence, a short road, clean, apparently safe. The other was truth and a prolonged confrontation, where he could lose everything. Meanwhile, Kayla kept going to work, trying to hold on to a normal life, but she could feel the pressure tightening like rope. Every unknown text, every unfamiliar person lingering too long outside the used bookstore, every call with nothing on the other end, brought her back to the threat about the past. Silas kept his distance, but his presence felt like a protective shadow, making her steadier while also making her afraid she would become the reason for another war. Grant raced time, pushing the attorney to finalize the witness protection agreement and coordinating with Officer Price to prepare the next step. But Madison didn't wait. She increased the pressure another way, without violence, only by planting the feeling that Aiden wasn't safe, even if he stayed silent. An anonymous post appeared on a professional forum, mentioning a technician who had interfered with camera data, hinting at vague misconduct. An old friend texted Aiden asking if it was true he was mixed up in the Caruso situation. Those little psychological hooks were enough to keep Aiden from sleeping. And then, late one night, Grant received a message from Aiden. Not long, not polished, only one sentence that sounded like a confession from a man standing at the edge of a cliff. "I'll testify if I'm still alive to make it there." After Aiden's message to Grant, Kayla thought the pressure would shift toward the courtroom and the media, but Madison chose another direction, quieter and more ruthless, aiming straight at the place where Kayla was trying to rebuild her life with her own hands. One morning, as Kayla unlocked the bookstore and dusted a shelf near the window, the owner called her into the back room with a voice that sounded different, cautious, and worried. On the table sat an envelope, with no return address, along with color printouts and several screenshot pages. Kayla saw her name on the first line, and her heart dropped like stone. There were photos of her and Silas, but cropped at strange angles, time distorted, as if she were receiving something from him in the dark. Attached were chat messages presented as evidence, cold sentences, numbers laid out like a contract, and a closing line claiming Kayla had blackmailed a mafia boss in exchange for money and housing. The owner didn't shout. He didn't insult her. He only asked whether she could explain, because he didn't want the store dragged into a scandal. Kayla stood still, her mind blank for a few seconds, that old sensation returning like a hand around her throat. She had lived this moment before, the moment when someone placed a story over her head and waited for her to collapse. Her first instinct was to run, like 8 years ago when the dorm doors closed, when her phone vanished, when every explanation was swallowed by suspicious eyes. She glanced toward the door, heard customers flipping through books outside, and in her head one sentence echoed, "Leave before they look at you like trash." Then she remembered what she had said at her interview. "My name is Kayla Mercer," and she understood that if she ran today, she would run forever. Kayla took a breath, asked the owner for time to clarify, and requested permission to call her attorney. The owner nodded, but he said something that hurt more than doubt. "I believe you're a good person, but I don't want to be ruined." Kayla nodded without blame. She stepped outside through the back door and called Grant with shaking hands, forcing her voice steady. Grant listened without swearing or reacting emotionally. He only told her not to sign or admit to anything, and to send him every file immediately. Kayla photographed each page, each image, each chat segment, sent them off, then returned to stand in the back room facing the owner with a strange exhaustion, as if she had aged years in a single morning. The owner asked if she was involved with Silas Caruso. Kayla didn't deny it and didn't dramatize it. She said she was involved with a truth, and someone was using lies to kill that truth. About an hour later, Grant called back. His tone was steady, but Kayla could hear keyboards tapping and voices in the background, like a race in motion. Grant said the images had been manipulated by merging timestamps from 2 separate sources, with compression artifacts showing editing at specific layers, and that the chat logs were fabricated because the metadata didn't align, the fonts and formatting matching a common screenshot template generator. He would send Kayla a concise technical comparison, simple enough for a non-expert to understand the fabrication. Grant added something more important, that Silas wouldn't appear at the bookstore, because his presence would cast Kayla as a shadow under power, and Kayla needed to reclaim her position with her own truth. Kayla listened, her heart pounding, both afraid and grateful. She returned to the back room, placed her phone on the table, and opened Grant's email. The comparison document was clear, each inconsistency circled, each sign of manipulation explained in short sentences. Kayla handed it to the owner, without pleading, without trying to make herself pitiful. She said this was a dirty move, and she would pursue it to the end, but she respected his right if he wanted her to step away temporarily to protect the store. The owner read in silence, then looked at Kayla longer than before. Finally, he exhaled and said he would give her a chance, but she had to promise not to let the store be dragged into another storm. Kayla nodded. When she stepped back to the counter, A customer waiting asked if she had any books about starting over. Kayla offered a thin volume with a faint smile, and inside her was a feeling that was both painful and solid, because she hadn't run. But when her shift ended, and Kayla opened the small mailbox outside her apartment, she found a white envelope from a government office. She tore it open, read it, and her face went cold. The letter required her to appear for identity verification due to inconsistencies in her records. It wasn't a friendly invitation, it was an official summons, and Kayla understood someone was trying to pull her into a maze of paperwork, where a single misplaced mark could cost her everything all over again. The letter demanding identity verification yanked Kayla out of the rhythm she had only just stitched back together, and the next morning she walked into the government building with the feeling of entering a windowless room. The hallway was long, the light a pale white, the smell of old paper mixed with cleaning chemicals, and plastic chairs lined up in rows where people sat with their heads down, waiting to have their names called. Kayla held the envelope in her hand, her palm damp with sweat, but her back stayed straight. She wasn't alone. The attorney Grant had arranged walked beside her, saying little, only reminding her to answer truthfully and let him handle the procedural parts. Kayla hated the feeling that she needed a representative to be treated decently, but she also knew this was a paperwork game where one wrong sentence could turn her into a liar on record. When it was her turn, a staff member led her into a small room with pale gray walls, one table and 2 chairs, a recorder set neatly in the corner like a cold eye. The interviewer was an official with an even voice, not overtly harsh but sharp as paper cuts, who began by asking Kayla to confirm her full name and date of birth, then immediately shifted into rapid questions, as if testing where she might stumble. Why she had lost her documents, why she hadn't reported it immediately, why there was a gap of many years with no fixed address, why there were entries in her file listing an address she said she had never lived at, why the timeline didn't match between her statement and administrative records. Kayla heard each question like a hammer against a wall, not because she was guilty, but because she had lived long enough to know poor people were often questioned, as if they had to prove they deserved to exist. She felt humiliation, not because of the questions themselves, but because memory was being dragged out of hiding and laid on the table beneath cold light. For a moment she wanted to cry, wanted to say she had slept at bus stations, had lost her phone in the night with no one to call, had knocked on doors begging for help only to be looked at like trouble. But she knew that if she sobbed, they would write in the record that she was agitated. If she got angry, they would write that she was uncooperative. Kayla took a breath, placed both hands on her thighs to keep them from shaking, and answered slowly and clearly, like someone sewing truth back together with strong thread. She said she had lost her documents on a chaotic night when she was forced to leave temporary housing, that she had tried to report it, but she had no phone, no address to receive any response, and when you have no place to stand, every procedure turns you into a ghost. She said she had no intent to deceive. Her only goal had been to survive the next day. The interviewer cut in and asked whether she had proof. Kayla looked straight ahead and said she had no physical proof for every night she had slept outside. But she had the one truth no one could take from her. I survived. That's the one truth no one can take. The sentence wasn't meant to win sympathy. It was meant to keep her dignity from being crushed into numbers in a flawed file. Grant's attorney intervened at exactly the right moment, not arguing emotionally, only requesting that every question be documented properly, requesting the specific reason for the summons, and submitting the temporary documents Kayla had been issued recently. He stated that Kayla was in the process of restoring her legal identity, that every change had been handled through legal channels, and that if there were discrepancies, the agency needed to specify which source data conflicted. The interviewer looked briefly irritated to see Kayla wasn't alone, but continued pressing, producing a printed page showing that the system had once recorded an update to Kayla's address and contact number years earlier. An update Kayla insisted she had never made. Kayla stared at the printout, her heart tightening, because that address wasn't one she had ever lived at. Yet it was almost the perfect trap, enough for someone to claim she had lied. The attorney leaned in to examine it closely and asked for the update date and the account used. The interviewer replied that the system only logged an employee code, not a name, because the data was old. At that exact moment, another staff member stepped in, leaned close to whisper something to the interviewer, and the interviewer's eyes shifted, just slightly, like someone who had realized something wasn't right. Grant's attorney saw it too and requested a pause so he could copy the system record under the right to access the file. The interviewer hesitated, then agreed within limits. The unexpected twist lived right there. Because when they dug deeper, they found signs that a field had been manually altered, outside the automatic process, and the edit timestamp aligned with the period when the Crane family had been cleaning up the fallout from the trap years ago. Kayla heard those words and felt ice slide up her spine. She no longer believed this was a simple administrative error. This was someone's hand on her life, a hand that had been there for a long time and still hadn't let go. When Kayla and the attorney stepped out, Officer Jordan Price was waiting in the hallway, not in uniform, but with the walk and eyes that made people lower their voices without thinking. He said, plainly, that he had just received an internal report about irregularities in Kayla's file, and he didn't believe it was accidental. He looked at Kayla like a witness, not a suspect, and said there could be a Crane hand inside the system. And if that was true, this wouldn't be just media smears anymore. This would be a real investigation. What Officer Price said about signs of file tampering didn't just chill Kayla, it made Silas understand that this fight had reached the deepest layer of the system, where the smartest enemies didn't use fists, but paperwork to kill. That night, after Kayla was escorted home safely, and the attorney continued coordinating with the agency, Silas returned to an unmarked office building where the most important Caruso meetings never appeared on any calendar. The air in the conference room was thick with the scent of wood and black coffee. Men in dark suits sat around a long table, no one raising their voice, but the whispering tension was visible in their eyes. They wouldn't criticize Silas openly, because everyone knew that was career suicide, yet they couldn't hide their unease. Some believed the boss had let emotions steer him off course. Some worried that media pressure and investigation would drag down projects, funds, shell companies. Others saw Kayla simply as a vulnerability, a weak point that could be exploited to fracture the entire organization. Silas entered without ceremony. He placed his phone on the table, looked at each man like reviewing a risk register, and said in a low voice that starting today there was a new rule, non-negotiable. Anyone who touched Kayla, directly or indirectly, would be considered acting against the organization's interests. No matter the excuse, no matter whether fear or money was the motive, the outcome would be the same. A few brows tightened, voices cautiously suggesting they only wanted to protect Caruso from exposure. Silas didn't argue. He said Kayla wasn't exposure. Kayla was truth, and this organization had survived because it protected its own truth before defending lies others invented. Someone dared to ask whether, if media attacks continued and investigators dug deeper, they should handle it the usual way and extinguish the fire early. That was the trap they hoped Silas would step into, to turn him into the violent image rumor painted. Silas looked at the man, eyes cold, and the fake-out unfolded in silence. He didn't shout. He didn't slam the table. He only nodded to Grant. Grant opened his laptop and projected an internal financial dashboard, columns of numbers and access logs. Silas said calmly that anyone thinking of putting out fire with dirty methods was forgetting that the biggest fires always started inside, from a hand taking money from the wrong place and believing no one would notice. He didn't name anyone yet. He spoke about discipline through law and money, forces more frightening than threats. Within 10 minutes, Silas revoked 2 executives' access to a critical project, froze this month's profit distribution for a specific group, and reassigned signing authority without explanation. No one was dragged out. No one was struck. Yet the room fell silent, because they understood that being removed from the circle of trust in this world meant losing the air you breathed. When one man opened his mouth to object, Silas simply said, "This wasn't a discussion, it was a notice." Then he switched to another screen and added that any unauthorized contact with the Crane side would be treated as information leakage under internal contract, subject to recovery actions, lawsuits, and asset freezes. It was punishment without blood, but far more terrifying because it destroyed lives legally. After the meeting, Grant pulled Silas into a smaller room and showed him a short report. He had reviewed call records and data access logs over recent days, and one name surfaced. Not a frontline operative, but a mid-level financial manager with access to shell accounts. That individual had transmitted encrypted data packages outward at the exact time Madison began her counterattack, with fabricated media and witness pressure. A quiet reveal, but cold enough. Someone inside was feeding Madison. Silas didn't look surprised, as if he had been waiting for this moment. He only asked Grant whether he was certain. Grant nodded, saying the evidence wasn't yet enough for immediate confrontation, but sufficient to set a counterintelligence trap. Silas said there was no need for something elaborate. Let the man expose himself. As Grant prepared to move, another alert appeared on the internal legal screen. An anonymous complaint had been filed with a financial oversight agency, accusing a Caruso-affiliated company of laundering money through irregular transactions, supported by documents that looked official. Silas read the headline, and his eyes darkened. This was no longer about smearing Kayla. The traitor had tried to frame him with a financial charge heavy enough to drag the entire empire underwater, and if he misstepped, Kayla would be crushed alongside him in a storm his enemy had carefully engineered. The session was held in an investigative conference room. No towering wooden bench like in courtroom dramas, just a long table, recording devices, a few flags in the corner, and cold white lights that made everyone look more exposed and less able to hide. No one here was allowed to perform. Officer Jordan Price sat at the head of the table with a prosecutor, his voice steady as he opened the file, and stated clearly that the purpose was to clarify a chain of fabrication, data manipulation, defamation, and interference with official records. Patricia Crane entered with the posture of someone accustomed to walking through rooms of power, impeccably dressed, jewelry restrained, her social smile still resting on her lips. Madison walked beside her, makeup carefully done, but her eyes tired, like someone who had spent nights crying and calculating at the same time. Their attorney sat down and placed his briefcase on the table like a shield. Across from them, Kayla sat with the independent attorney Grant had introduced, her hands resting neatly, not curled inward, though her heart beat fast inside her chest. Because here, truth was no longer a story. It was a record. Silas wasn't in the room, by agreement, to avoid turning the session into a display of power. Grant was present, but one step back, making sure Kayla wasn't overshadowed. Officer Price began not by replaying the video that had detonated the wedding, but by presenting the verified legal fragments uncovered afterward. System access logs, the history of manual edits in Kayla's administrative file, correspondence trails with media outlets, and traces linking Crane representatives to tabloid sources. Patricia maintained her composure, saying this was all a misunderstanding, that she couldn't control everything written online, that she herself was the victim of a smear campaign against her family. Madison nodded along, her voice trembling but softened, emphasizing how her wedding day had been ruined and her mental state shattered. The prosecutor didn't argue emotions. They went straight to the point Patricia couldn't polish away. They called in a witness. Aidan Locke entered, no longer hiding under a low cap, though his hands still trembled slightly. He had been granted appropriate protection, and that steadied him. He didn't retell the entire history. This session didn't need drama. It needed 2 new sentences to seal the exit. Aidan looked at the record and stated that he confirmed a transfer of funds from an intermediary account linked to the Crane ecosystem, routed through a shell company, and paid to a broker to stage the setup and facilitate the intentional extraction of camera footage. Then he added one more line, naming the intermediary as an individual who had worked for the media agency managed by Madison, the same person who contacted him after the wedding to suggest signing a vague clarification statement. The sentences weren't long, but they struck like nails driven into wood. Madison half rose from her chair, her voice rising sharply, accusing him of lying, claiming he had been bought. Her attorney immediately objected, but Officer Price instructed them to maintain order. Patricia turned toward Madison, her eyes icing over, though she still forced a thin smile, saying Madison was emotional. Then, the unexpected twist shattered the frame. Madison spun toward her mother, her voice breaking, no longer contained, declaring that everything had been her mother's plan, that her mother had taught her how to manipulate people, that her mother had insisted she keep Silas at any cost, because he was the only ticket securing their family's stability. Madison said she had only followed the strategy, that her mother had cleaned up the mess before and promised to do it again. The room went silent for a full second, as if all the air had been pulled out. Patricia looked at her daughter like at a true betrayer, and this time, she couldn't perform. She struck back instantly, her voice sharp as a blade, telling Madison not to pretend to be a victim, that Madison had always been the most ambitious one, that she needed no lessons to use others as stepping stones. She said if Madison hadn't wanted it, she could have stopped, but she had chosen to go all the way. Mother and daughter tore into each other in front of the official record, in front of people immune to tears and reputation. Kayla sat there, feeling as though she was listening to 2 people competing for the right to be cruel. and she realized the most frightening thing about power wasn't money. It was the ability to make people forget the boundary of conscience. The prosecutor invited Kayla to speak. No one asked her to recount her tragedy. Just one statement for the record about impact and intent. Kayla stood, steady, eyes forward, voice clear and calm, not raised in anger, but measured like an oath. I don't need them to hurt the way I did. I only need them to never do this to anyone else. The room fell completely silent, because she wasn't asking for sympathy. She was demanding a boundary for society. Officer Price nodded and recorded it. The session closed with notice of continued investigation into organized data interference and defamation charges. As people rose, Madison leaned toward her attorney and whispered something Kayla couldn't hear, but Grant read it instantly from the shift in the lawyer's face. Madison was playing her final card. She was threatening to sell information about Silas, things she knew from the wedding preparations and connections she had accessed, in exchange for leniency. And Grant understood that if Madison followed through, the battle would spill from a conference room into an entire city, dragging Kayla and Silas into a storm far larger than the one they had already survived. After the confrontation session, the media didn't fall silent as many had hoped. It shifted to another level, where every headline placed the name Silas Caruso beside words like investigation, financial ecosystem, and shadow power. News channels dissected his every move, invited experts to speculate about whether the Caruso empire was trembling, and replayed images of the canceled wedding as a symbol of a fractured reign. The financial complaint filed by the internal trader began to draw attention from oversight authorities. There was no conclusion yet, but the mere phrase "under investigation" was enough to make partners hesitate. Kayla saw it all on the television screen in her small apartment, heard her own name woven into a narrative far larger than herself. She began to feel like the starting point of the storm, even though reason told her that wrongdoing didn't begin with her existence, but with other people's choices. Yet the feeling of being a burden isn't something reason easily erases. That night, heavy rain fell, wind striking the windows as if reminding them nothing was settled. Kayla sat on the floor and opened the small bag that had followed her through so many years. She folded a few clothes, slipped the old library card into the inside pocket of her coat. She didn't write a note. She didn't dramatize the decision. She only thought that if she left, at least Silas wouldn't have such an obvious vulnerability to exploit. She was used to disappearing so others could be safe. As she pulled her suitcase toward the door, a soft knock sounded. Silas stood there, rain on his coat, no bodyguards, no noise. He looked at the suitcase, looked at Kayla, and didn't ask where she planned to go. He stepped inside, closed the door so the wind wouldn't drive rain across the floor, and stood at a distance that didn't invade her space. He said he knew the media was pulling him into the eye of the storm, knew the complaint could open a long chain of investigations, and knew Kayla was thinking she was the cause. Kayla didn't deny it. She said she didn't want to be the excuse people used to attack him, didn't want her name tied to a war that could cost him everything. Silas shook his head gently, his voice low but not commanding. I didn't save you to ease my guilt. I choose you if you choose me back. The sentence wasn't ornate, didn't promise protection through power. It placed responsibility on equal ground. Kayla looked at him for a long time, listening to rain strike the glass like time knocking at the door. She understood that if she stayed, she would face pressure, cruel words, unknown risks. But if she left out of fear, she would repeat the old circle where others decided her path. She set the suitcase down and spoke her final conditions slowly, as if carving them into the air. No rushed wedding, no turning her story into a public relations strategy. No one, including him, stepping over her boundaries when she said no. And if one day she felt herself pulled into a role that wasn't hers, she would walk away without asking permission. Silas listened to every condition and nodded without hesitation. He said he agreed, not because he was afraid of losing her, but because if he couldn't respect those boundaries, he didn't deserve to be chosen. Kayla stepped one pace closer, not out of weakness, but because she wanted her choice to be active. She said she was staying not out of fear, but because she wanted to see whether they could build something not rooted in power and guilt. Outside, the rain kept falling, but inside the small room, there was no longer the sound of a suitcase being dragged. At that moment, Silas's phone vibrated. The attorney was calling, voice serious but steady, informing him that a new complaint had been filed, targeting a shell company within the Caruso system, along with a request for a comprehensive audit. The war wasn't over. It had only shifted into another chapter where truth and power would continue to collide. Kayla listened and didn't step back. She looked at Silas and said that if they moved forward, they would move with truth and law, not fear. Silas nodded. The stormy night closed, not with a fairy tale, but with a mature decision, a commitment between two people who had once lost faith, yet still dared to try again. This story isn't only about a mafia boss and a homeless woman. It's about the value of dignity, about how truth can be buried but never erased if someone dares to stand for it. It reminds us that no one should be defined by another person's wrongdoing, and that the choice to stay or leave must come from self-respect, not fear. How did this story make you feel? Have you ever stood before a decision that made you want to run, yet chose to stay because you believed in your own worth? Share your thoughts in the comments so we can listen from the depth of your heart. If you enjoy emotional stories layered with meaning like this one, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share to support us, and watch more compelling videos every day. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Wishing you health, joy, and peace in each day ahead. Goodbye and see you in the next video.